Welcome back to Philosophy 1101, Problems of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut. Today will be our second discussion of ethics, and in this discussion we'll talk primarily about challenges to and extensions of utilitarianism, and we'll have a discussion of the doctrine of relativism as well. So I'd like you to think for a moment about what a utilitarian, for example, John Stuart Mill, would have to say about the ethical status of non-human animals. Remember that the utilitarian doctrine had said that the right action is one that maximizes the overall, so to speak, global amount of happiness, minimizes the amount of suffering and pain, etc. And there's nothing in that definition that makes any specific reference to the happiness or unhappiness, pleasure, pain, etc. of members of our own species. So it would seem that if you can perform an action that will increase the well-being of non-human animals, in particular those non-human animals that are capable of feeling happiness, that are capable of feeling pleasure, and other types of valuable states of mind, then that's a strike in favor, that's a consideration in favor of that action. So too, if there's a way of avoiding an action that would be likely to produce suffering on the part of non-human animals, the utilitarian will say, you've got reason for doing so, that is avoiding that action rather than causing that suffering. So we might distinguish between, on the one hand, an absolute prohibition against, for example, eating meat, or engaging in animal testing, or for that matter, just torturing non-human animals, on the one hand, or on the other hand, a general rule of thumb that says because non-human animals are capable of suffering, it's therefore best to avoid causing them pain, and therefore better to go out of your way, do whatever you can to increase their general well-being. So now, I want you to think about the question whether or not the utilitarian will have an absolute prohibition or just a general directive in favor of, including within the circle of ethically significant beings, non-human animals, rather than just members of our own species. I'd like you to reflect on that, and hopefully that will be a basis for discussion for you in this course. One topic that I think you might find of interest is what's known as the Great Ape Project, in which philosophers, others concerned with non-human animals, particularly other great apes besides ourselves, in particular chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans, proponents of the Great Ape Project have been arguing that the United Nations should develop not just a Declaration of Human Rights, which it already has, but have a declaration on great apes. The idea being that these are creatures that have many characteristics similar to those of members of our own species, and that they should be considered part of a community of equals with members of our own species, and we should do everything we can to avoid torture, to avoid using them for entertainment. We should respect their land rights, for example. So the Great Ape Project aims to include in the circle of non-human animals fellow great apes, which are capable of fairly sophisticated forms of cognition, certain kinds of self-awareness. It certainly seems that they're capable of higher order emotions of the sort that we've discussed before, for example, and that's reason for thinking that great apes should be part of that circle as well. But again, one might wonder whether or not the utilitarian will say great apes should be considered as having inalienable rights in the way that we often think that human beings do, or whether or not because they're capable of suffering, feeling pain, pleasure, etc., they should be considered in the way that we consider all possible consequences with regard to the pleasure or pain-making implications of our actions. Now, another thing I want you to consider when discussing utilitarianism is the nature of the pleasures, happiness, etc., that somebody can experience in response to situations around her or him. So if we're talking about, from the utilitarian point of view, the project of maximizing well-being or maximizing pleasure or maximizing happiness, where in our discussion of Mill in our last lecture, we noticed that even if pleasure and happiness are both in some sense in the same general area or category, nevertheless happiness is going to be broader and more inclusive because some pleasures will be higher or some forms of happiness will be more sophisticated than others. But what about those forms of pleasure that somebody might take in the downfall or suffering or unhappiness or other kind of pain in someone else? So suppose in our utilitarian calculation, we're deciding when figuring out what to do, we notice that some people take a great deal of pleasure in watching others suffer. whether it be real life people or people that are just virtual in cartoons or video games, something of the kind. Should those pleasures that the so-called wicked pleasures, should those wicked pleasures be ones that we should acknowledge as part of our utilitarian calculation? This notion, the German word is Schadenfreude, that is to say, taking pleasure in somebody else's well-being. That word has made its way into English to some extent as well. Should Schadenfreude types of pleasures be considered as part of our calculation? One feels that there's something immoral about taking pleasure in somebody else's suffering, but nevertheless, it's pleasure all the same for those people who experience these things. So should that count as a consideration, a factor, part of our philosophic calculus, as it were, or not? Likewise, imagine somebody is a sadist and they take great pleasure in either real or imaginary torturing of someone else. Suppose, just for the imaginary case, suppose somebody sets up a virtual reality kind of system in which they have a very vivid experience in which they're causing somebody else a great deal of suffering. They apparently, the person who has the virtual experience of causing this, seem to get a great deal of pleasure out of that. Is that something that we should count as part of our utilitarian calculation or not? I don't want to try to settle that question, but it's a question I'd like you to consider. If you feel that there's something immoral about taking pleasure in somebody else's, whether that person is fictional or real, somebody else's suffering, then I want to suggest that you may be tapping into an ethical sensibility that perhaps is not going to be captured fully by the utilitarian perspective. That is to say, if you think that, no, it's wrong to allow the sadist, even the virtual reality sadist, to have pleasures that count in the philosophic calculus, then what you're implicitly admitting, I think, is that there are, in your view, limitations on the utilitarian method for determining what is right or what is wrong. My next point is about, again, not by way of a criticism of utilitarianism, but rather more of a drawing out of its implications to help you to think through your own stand on this powerful and embracing ethical theory. Think about the nature of punishment. Think about our very familiar, all too familiar system of punishment, in particular as carried out by legal institutions, prisons, etc. If you consider on the face of it, there's something prima facie kind of paradoxical about the idea of punishment. As I mentioned to you before, when I was a kid, I'd get in fights with my brothers, and one or the other, my parents would say, 2 wrongs don't make a right. Just because he punched you doesn't mean it's okay for you to punch him back, etc. And there's something right in my parents' precept that just because a harm has been done, that doesn't make it okay to inflict another harm. But from a certain perspective, you might say punishing is kind of paradoxical because somebody has done a crime, they say have broken the law, and now we're going to, and in so doing, this person might have caused somebody harm, okay, might have taken something from somebody and caused that person, the victim, to suffer, for example. But in so doing, in punishing that person, we're causing more harm. We're causing the perpetrator to suffer. Why is that a reasonable thing to do? How does that go beyond the fairly unsophisticated idea of an eye for an eye? How does that go beyond, how is that consistent with the fact that we don't think the 2 wrongs make a right? Well, traditionally there have been 3 general types of justifications that philosophers, legal theorists, and others have developed for the idea that we might want to punish a criminal, that is a person that we know to have violated a law. One is what's known as retribution, where retribution suggests that somehow the person who's done the crime is, in a sense, deserving of some kind of suffering, incarceration, for example, in some cases maybe the loss of their life, that somehow they owe us, even beyond perhaps repaying the debt that they owe us if they've taken something that's got some value. Nevertheless, and beyond that, they owe us a certain kind of good, and the only way to give us back that good is for them to suffer. Another way to think about retribution might be as follows, that we owe them, the criminal, out of respect as a fellow person, the opportunity to regain their value as a fellow human being, and in so doing, we are going to give them, so to speak, metaphorically, a very tough scrub brush and allow them to scrub themselves clean, and if they can't do it themselves, we will help them. And that way of thinking about it, we are paying respect to the criminal by punishing them, not just the victim, but the criminal, because this gives them a chance to make amends. That's the two different flavors of the retributivist theory of the justification for punishment. Another general approach to the justification for punishment goes under the general rubric of deterrence. Deterrence is, as you can imagine, keep people from doing that kind of thing now that a crime has been committed. And deterrence falls into two general categories, special and general. Special deterrence is just, we punish you because this is going to keep you from doing that bad thing again. Whereas general deterrence is, we punish you because in doing so we set an example in the hope that other people will not do that same kind of thing in the future. They will be deterred from that kind of behavior by seeing you punished in the way that we're punishing you. That's the deterrence kind of approach. And the third is a little bit more nebulous. It's not quite as established, but some philosophers and others will talk about the idea of punishment as an expression of an attitude. For example, of respect for the victim or even the perpetrator. The expressive role of punishment as a way of sort of manifesting and perhaps also solidifying social values and solidarity of a certain kind. Now, if we think about punishment from a utilitarian point of view, we need to ask which of any of these three justifications, and of course, one might justify punishment on more than just one of these. One might think that all three of them work, or two of the three are parts of our justifications. If you're a utilitarian, you might ask, what value is there in punishing? Which of these three sources of value might we have as something that's consistent with utilitarianism? And I want to suggest the most natural way of thinking about punishment from the utilitarian point of view is the deterrence approach. That is to say, we're deciding we've got a criminal in our hands. It's clear that he has broken the law. It's clear that something has been done, and the act has been perpetrated. We've got him here. Now, what should we do? Well, here we are. It's now time to think about the future. What action is going to be the one that maximizes well-being for the future, that maximizes happiness overall? And the fact that this crime has been committed in the past does not itself have any special value. We need to look forward. And then the question is, well, will punishing this person prevent him from doing this again, or will it prevent others from doing the same kind of thing again? That's the only question that I think that can make sense from the point of view of the utilitarian. If, on the other hand, we can be sure that this person who clearly did a crime, nevertheless is certain never to do it again, we've got reasons from our specialist psychologists or psychotherapists to ensure us that this will not occur, and there's no general deterrence kind of justification in the offing, perhaps because the crime was too subtle or sophisticated or rare, then there won't be any justification for punishing this person. One just has to let him go. That is to say, by contrast, the idea of cleansing the stain in the soul of the perpetrator is not going to make a great deal of sense from the point of view of the utilitarian. The question is, what will produce the greatest overall amount of well-being for the future? So that has an implication that I want you to think about. If you think about what you find to be valuable and worthwhile and justifiable in punishing a perpetrator of a crime, does the utilitarian story give you enough? Or do you think that even if there's no deterrent effect that is likely at all to happen, we nevertheless are obliged to punish somebody because doing so, for example, that person deserves it and the victim deserves this kind of treatment? That is to say that the victim's attacker, for example, get punished in a certain way. That retributivist way of thinking is going to not make a lot of sense from the point of view of utilitarianism. So the utilitarian has consequences for the justification for punishment, which might or might not jibe with your intuitive views about what justifies punishment, and you have to ask yourself, does that somehow put pressure on the utilitarian theory, or should that make me revise my views about what justifies punishment? Again, not something that I'm trying to offer as a direct attack on the utilitarian theory, but something I want to suggest is food for thought, helping you to think about where you stand relative to this complex philosophical doctrine. And now I want to move on to a more direct criticism of the utilitarian theory, and I'll formulate it in a couple of different ways to help you get a feel for how the criticism goes. And one way of putting the criticism is typified, crystallized by the philosopher Carrot, who writes about Mill. In short, utilitarianism has forgotten rights. It allows no right to a man because he is innocent, or because he has worked hard, or has been promised or injured, or because he stands in any other special relation to us. It thinks only of duties, or rather of one single duty, namely to dump happiness wherever we most conveniently can. And the idea that Carrot has in mind can be explained in terms of his example of the Arctic explorers. Suppose there are a couple of explorers making their way through the Arctic, such of it as still exists in this era of global warming, and they are lost in the middle of a terrible blizzard, and they realize that there's only enough food, given the amount of time they have, how long it will take to get back to base camp and so forth. There's only enough food for one of them to get back to base camp alive. The other one's going to have to give it up and just die right there. Maybe someone will come to rescue him, but the chances are pretty small. So one of the explorers says, look, I'm less strong than you are, I'm older than you are, you've got more life ahead of you, etc. What I want you to do is take the food, do the best you can to get back to base camp. I'll give it up right here, take everything from me that you need. All I ask is that you promise that when you get back to home, but get back to civilization and so forth, you make sure that my children, I suppose this explorer has 3 children, that my children get a proper education. Here's all the access that you need to all the bank account information that you would need in order to get their funds. What I want you to do is put those in a trust, do whatever you need to, make sure they get a proper education in college, beyond, etc. So the 2 men make a promise. One of them packs up, takes the food that's necessary, heads out to base camp, and ends up surviving. The other one passes away in the cold. Now, some time goes by. The man who survived gets back to home, say in the United States, and he's a utilitarian. So he gets back home and he says, well, it's true that I made a promise. I also have access to this fellow's money. And he's got those 3 children. They do need to be taken care of. But I'm a utilitarian, and my obligation, if any, is to use that money in whatever way I think will maximize overall utility. Perhaps educating the 3 boys is a way of doing so, but maybe giving that money to charity is a better way, or maybe investing it to start a business that I think is likely to produce a great deal of good is a better way to do so. There are lots of things that I might have in mind. What matters for our purposes is the following: that from the point of view of the explorer who survived, the fact that a promise was made in the past doesn't have any special hold over him. Because after all, he's a utilitarian. He's now in the present. The past is done. He needs to maximize utility. The fact that he made a promise does not have any special authority over his behavior now. Well, the only thing that has special authority over his behavior now is that he needs to maximize overall well-being. That might or might not happen by virtue of his helping the fellow explorers' children get an education. So, Carrot writes, on the utilitarian theory, then, it's the duty of the returned traveler to act precisely as he ought to act if no bargain had ever been made, to consider how he can spend his money, now his, most expediently for the happiness of mankind, and if he thinks his own child is a genius, to spend it on him. The fact that a promise has been made has no special power over the explorer that survived. Now, to many of us, that implication, which does seem to be an implication of the utilitarian theory, seems somehow offensive, seems somehow noxious. Something about it, something about the fact that I made a promise to someone seems like it ought to have a kind of moral hold over me. And so we have a choice. Do we have to say, with perhaps what Mill would say, well, actually, promises only go so far, and utilitarianism always trumps any value or any power that a promise has? Or should we say, no, a promise is a promise, your word is your bond, stick with it, and if the utilitarian theory says otherwise, so much the worse for the utilitarian theory. I want you to think about whether or not that's a proper implication of the utilitarian theory, and if so, where do you stand? Do you say so much the worse for the utilitarian theory, or do you say so much the worse for our practices of promise making and truth telling and things of the kind? Again, not an issue I want to try to decide here, but one where I want to try to put the pressure on you a little bit to get you to see the implications of this moral theory, which is complex and which when you first encountered might have seemed banal and obvious, but now turns out to have some surprising consequences. Here's another example to help you get a feel for the kind of thing I'm trying to get at here. Suppose that there's a vagrant who hangs out next to a big hospital. His name is Rufus. And he apparently doesn't have any friends, doesn't have any family. He just kind of hangs out, and he's a friendly enough guy, but no one knows him very well. And there's a doctor who works in the hospital. His name is Dr. Jones. He examines Rufus every once in a while. Perhaps now Rufus now comes in for an infection on his hand, for example. And then Dr. Jones gets to thinking one day. Dr. Jones notices that there are 10 young prodigies at various parts in the hospital at this point, each of whom could be saved by, in one case, a donated liver, in another case, part of a lung, in another case, a skin graft, etc. Each of them is a prodigy. One is the most fantastic pianist Dr. Jones or anybody else had ever seen. Another one is a fantastic mathematician. Another one has an absolutely gorgeous voice, etc., for all the remaining of the 10 children. So each of these 10 children is in a situation in which they may very well die unless they get a missing organ or part of an organ, be it skin or liver or heart or lung, etc. And Dr. Jones begins to think, well, if I'm a utilitarian, and I think I am, if I could somehow ever so quietly euthanize Rufus in such a way as that no one finds out, maybe even I could take a pill that would cause me to forget that this ever happened after I do it, just to make sure that I don't have twinges of conscience after doing it. We euthanize Rufus. We harvest as many of his organs as we can. We give them to the children in need. We save 10 lives. Rufus was not doing much of anything anyway. He was kind of hanging out. No one's going to miss him much. And we could save 10 lives for lives of children that are very likely to produce great things, do wonderful things as they grow. Now, as a utilitarian, wouldn't it be an appropriate thing to do to ever so quietly euthanize Rufus and save those 10 children? Again, the utilitarian seems to say the right thing to do, so long as no one will find out, as long as Dr. Jones can be made to forget the experience of doing so, maybe do this himself even without any nurses being involved. Wouldn't the utilitarian be obliged to say, yes, Dr. Jones is not just allowed to, but is required to euthanize this vagrant because doing so will maximize overall utility? So that's what the theory says, but notice that as a just ordinary human being thinking about right and wrong, many of us will recoil at the idea that you could involuntarily take somebody's life from him in order to save somebody else's. It's a fairly deep principle inside of our moral psyches, as it were, that makes us think that somehow doing something like that would be immoral. But if that's right, then the utilitarian theory seems to be telling us to do something, at least in certain hypothetical cases, that would be an immoral thing to do. So again, this is an implication that, as it were, turns up the heat a little bit on the utilitarian theory, one that therefore I want you to reflect on to see, again, where you stand relative to a case like this. Now, if Mill were here, he would have something to say in response, I think. On page 19 of the utilitarian book, he writes of a case that's not too radically different from the kinds of cases we've been discussing thus far. He writes, "It would be unworthy of an intelligent agent not to be consciously aware that the action being considered here is of a class which, if practiced generally, would be generally injurious, and that this is the ground of the obligation to abstain from it." What he's saying, I think, is that the idea of euthanizing someone in order to save somebody else's life, especially if euthanizing the person would be involuntary, that kind of act would be one which, if practiced generally, would be very injurious to society as a whole, because then we'd have squads going around saying, there's somebody who's fairly infirm or not very productive. We'd better see whether she's got a heart that we could use to save this very intelligent person over here who has a need of a heart transplant. And there's somebody who is dying of cancer. She's got a year to live perhaps, but she's got skin. Let's harvest her skin now while it's still good for someone who just got injured in a fire, and let this person who's got a year of her life, let that year be shortened, etc. That would cause chaos and a great deal of anxiety in society if each of us knew that at any given time our number might be up because the utilitarian calculus might require that we be sacrificed for the greater good. That seems to be what Mill has in mind. And in light of that kind of thought, more recent philosophers have suggested that perhaps we could distinguish between two kinds of utilitarianism. Let's call them act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is just what we've seen before. Perform that act from those available, most likely to produce the greatest overall amount of utility. Rule utilitarianism is a little bit different, though, and more sophisticated. It says, perform that act from those available that accords with a rule that is itself part of a system of rules, the general following of which would produce the greatest overall amount of utility. That's more of a mouthful, but it's more sophisticated, more subtle, more carefully formulated to make references to the idea that the utilitarian wants to put in place rules that seem to have to be very firm, and they might say things like, tell the truth, or keep your promises, or don't take somebody's life against their will, etc. The whole system of rules are ones the following of which would be something that would produce the greatest overall amount of utility. So here's some examples of utilitarian rules, some of which we've seen before. Keep your promises. Tell the truth. Punish the wicked and only the wicked. To err is human, to forgive divine. That is, forgive people who've done things, nobody's perfect. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, the golden rule. Two wrongs don't make a right. That is, let's get beyond the Hammurabi Code, for example. Don't look a gift horse in the mouth. We've seen that one before. And to thine own self be true, another familiar one. You might say these are a set of utilitarian rules that are plausibly part of a system of rules, the general following of which would be felicific, that is, maximize overall well-being for society. So if that's right, then Mill might come back with our example of the Arctic explorers and Dr. Jones and Rufus and say, not so fast. On the rule utilitarian system of utilitarianism, these are both behaviors, breaking your promises, for example, and euthanizing someone who's innocent, are ones that would violate plausible utilitarian rules, and that's why, in good conscience as utilitarian, Mill would say, that's why I'm allowed to call these things wrong. But I'd like us to take a closer look at that line of thought. Mill writes on page 63 of Utilitarianism, he's discussing justice. Justice is a name for certain moral requirements which, regarded collectively, stand higher in the scale of social utility and are therefore of more paramount obligation than any others, though particular cases may occur in which some other social duty is so important as to overrule any one of the general maxims of justice. If you think about it, then what he's saying is that justice, principles of justice like be fair to people, respect individual autonomy and so forth, are all very nice, and they stand pretty high in the hierarchy of things that we care about, but there might be cases in which we might have to give one up, in which overall utility is going to trump one of these putative rules. That's kind of puzzling. Mill goes on when he talks about persons and the idea that a person has a right. All persons are deemed to have a right to equality of treatment, except when some recognized social expediency requires the reverse. So there's something kind of chilling, if you think about it, about this formulation, because he's saying, yes, people have rights up to a limit, but social expediency can sometimes overrule somebody's claim to a right. And when that happens, the utilitarian calculus is going to take over. So we might wonder, for those of us who think that people have inalienable rights, it's beginning to sound like the utilitarian is saying some rights are alienable after all. In fact, maybe all rights are alienable after all. It's all a matter of what the utilitarian calculus provides. And likewise, if you think about what those rules are in the rule utilitarian system, we might wonder whether or not the utilitarian is really can consistently appeal to them as carrying a lot of weight and as being absolute. So the philosopher J.J.C. Smart once wrote, is it not monstrous to suppose that if we have worked out the consequences, and if we have perfect faith in the impartiality of our calculations, and if we know that in this instance, to break a rule R, part of some rule utilitarian system, will have better results than to keep it, that we should nevertheless obey the rule? That seems like a kind of rule worship, Smart suggests. And if you're a utilitarian of any kind, it seems like it would be just crazy to know that by following a rule, for example, keeping your promises, is going to be one that is not the best way of maximizing overall utility. So let's imagine that we were trying to formulate, to see this in more detail, let's imagine that we were trying to formulate a system of rules. Suppose we had a convention. All the world's leading social psychologists and economists and philosophers and others got together and said, we're going to come up with a system of utilitarian rules that we can really live by. So everybody's excited about trying to finally formulate the appropriate system of rules that we can set down as being settled. And the convention starts promptly 9 o'clock on a Monday morning. Everybody's ready to go. And somebody stands up and says, one of the delegates stands up and says, I propose as a first rule the following: never punish the innocent. And everybody applauds and is very excited and everybody's very pleased. And then somebody else stands up and says, well, wait a minute, we're utilitarians, aren't we? We want to maximize overall utility. So we better qualify that rule a little bit with the following: never punish the innocent unless, of course, doing so is likely to produce a huge surplus of happiness over unhappiness. That seems like a better refinement, doesn't it? That is to say, that seems like a better way of formulating the rule, because a rule that says never punish the innocent could face a situation in which punishing the innocent is going to cause, say, many, many people, thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of people to suffer, die, whatever. So make an exception. Punish someone who's innocent if doing so will, for example, save 1 million lives. That seems like a utilitarian thing to do. So now after this delegate stands up and says her piece, everybody claps. And the next person to stand up says the following. Okay, I think even that needs a qualification, he points out. He says, here's what I would formulate. Never punish the innocent unless, of course, doing so is likely to produce, well, a surplus of happiness over unhappiness. That is to say, you can see how there could be a number of refinements, 17, 50, 100, between rule number 2 and the rule that we're at right now, because you can, as it were, shave away qualification after qualification to the point where what you're really saying is refrain from punishing the innocent unless doing so is going to be a way of maximizing overall utility. So what we see is that if you start out with a putative, common sense utilitarian rule such as never punish the innocent, if we're going to be genuine utilitarians, people will want to maximize overall utility in some sense, it looks like we have to face the possibility in which a rule like that, the common sense everyday rule that you might have learned at age 3, is going to face situations in which following it would not maximize utility, but where therefore breaking it is the way to maximize utility. And if you're not just engaging in rule worship, it seems like you need to break that rule. But once we keep on thinking of possible qualifications, clarifications, etc., of the rules we start out with, we always seem to end up with never do this wrong thing unless doing so produces a surplus of happiness over unhappiness. But if you think about that, the last rule that we just have here is just a long-winded way of saying maximize overall happiness. That is, perform that act that produces the greatest overall amount of happiness. And if that's right, then as we try to reach out and grab the rule utilitarian set of principles, what we find is instead just act utilitarianism after all. That is to say, it looks as if the idea of rule utilitarianism is, in a sense, unstable. We try to formulate the theory, we try to clarify it, we try to refine it, and what happens is the more we do that, the more it ends up shifting into the form of an act utilitarian system. That is to say, rule utilitarianism is a way, a kind of phantom. We reach out for it, there's nothing there. Once you try to formulate it, it ends up being act utilitarianism after all. That is, another way of putting the point is, either we engage in a form of rule worship, following a utilitarian rule, even when we know that doing so will not maximize overall utility or happiness, or we refine each alleged utilitarian rule to the point that it just restates act utilitarianism. If that's right, then we can't solve the problem posed by the cases of the Arctic explorers and of Rufus and Dr. Jones by appealing to rule utilitarianism rather than act utilitarianism. It looks like there's just going to be no way out but to accept the act utilitarian doctrine. So now that we've clarified that, if we're going to be utilitarians at all, we have to be act utilitarians. We can't make any special reference to rules such as never punish the innocent. Here's a case that I want to suggest is one that will at least put a good amount of pressure on the utilitarian theory, and then we'll see whether it breaks. Suppose, for example, that a terrorist has planted highly explosive, extremely powerful bombs all around the great city of Chicago, and they're all set to go off right before noon today, and you're the mayor, and you've just been notified of this. We have no way of finding the terrorist. and we have no way of defusing the bombs in time. And if we just try to tell everybody to evacuate the city, we've only got about an hour. If we tell everybody to evacuate the city, we'll probably cause a huge amount of stampeding, terror, chaos. Many, many lives will be lost. But one of your advisors comes to us and says, well, we do know where the terrorist's daughter is, and this terrorist has the only person in the world for whom he has any special feelings is his daughter. And we're in a position in which we could take her out of preschool. We know where her preschool is. We could put her on a camera and start torturing her. And our psychologists tell us that that's really the only way, but we know it's a very viable way to get the terrorist to break. Because it's only then, watching his daughter being tortured on television, live TV, that the terrorist will come to us and tell us how to defuse all those bombs. So now as a mayor, you've got to make a choice. Are you going to allow the terrorist to let those bombs go off? You might say his daughter is innocent. She didn't do anything. Why should we torture her? And by the way, this form of torture has to be pretty serious. It's the kind of torture that could put the daughter within risk of losing her life. You've got to make a choice. Are we going to grab the daughter and start torturing her even though she's perfectly innocent? Or are we going to just let things go and hope for the best and say, sorry, I didn't plant the bombs, it's not my fault? Utilitarianism seems to require that we torture and, if necessary, sacrifice the daughter if we're doing so makes us think that we're likely to get the terrorist to break and to defuse the bombs. Yet, imagine you're genuinely in the mayor's position. Would you be the one who makes the choice, who gives the directive to go find that daughter and start torturing her? You might feel doing so would be immoral. Many would say that doing so would be wrong no matter how much utility would be produced. That is to say, some people would say torturing an innocent child would be immoral no matter how much utility would be produced in doing so. The numbers don't matter. This is just wrong, period. So now we have a fairly definite clash between what I take many people to have to be a fairly strong moral principle, torturing an innocent person is just wrong, period, no matter what, on the one hand, and saving what might be 500,000, 700,000 lives of the people who live and or work in downtown Chicago inside the loop. We've got to make a choice. The utilitarian theory has a clear implication, I think, that you need to grab the daughter and do what you can with her in order to get the terrorist to break. But is that your view? Is that what you think is right? If you think there's something wrong about doing so, then it sounds like you're perhaps not any longer a utilitarian, even if you thought at the beginning of our discussions of this ethical theory that you were. Notice also that an advisor to the mayor to you might say, sir or madam, if you don't torture the terrorist's daughter, the deaths of at least perhaps 1 million Chicagoans will be on your head, for you will have had the opportunity to prevent these deaths and yet did nothing. So if you are faced with that charge, you might ask yourself, well, therefore, would I be morally responsible for the death and, in a sense, perhaps be morally responsible for killing all these Chicagoans because of my refusal to take action? This is what's known as a moral dilemma. No choice of the choices you've got available is one that you can feel very comfortable with. Of the choices that are available, something, no matter what you do, it's going to be awful, or likely to be awful. But you still should try to decide what you would do in a situation like that. And as you decide what you think is right or wrong, what the appropriate course of action is, you can use that gut intuition on your part as to right and wrong as a way of deciding the adequacy of the utilitarian theory. If you think that torturing the daughter would be wrong, even if doing so is likely to save a great many lives, but you want to say, no, it's wrong no matter what, then I submit to you, you are not a utilitarian after all. Now, as you think about this case, I want you to reflect a little bit on this is a bit by way of sort of intermission here in the course of our discussion of these ethical theories. Many people, when they're confronted with philosophers theorizing about right and wrong, are apt to respond with something like the following. Look, right and wrong are all a matter of your point of view, or they're subjective, or they're relative. So I want to discuss a bit this doctrine known as moral relativism to get us to think about what it means and to ask you whether or not it's something that you really want to accept. I don't want to try to argue that it's definitely right or wrong, but I want you to think through some of its implications in order to clarify your thinking about this. Some of the slogans that you'll sometimes hear under the general rubric of moral relativism are the following. Some people will say, it's all subjective anyway. Other people will say, it's all a matter of your point of view. Other people will say, who's to say? Others will say, how can I or anybody sit in judgment of someone else? I want to come back to each of these kinds of ideas in just a moment. But first, let me distinguish between two flavors of relativism. Just as we distinguish between two putative flavors of utilitarianism, I want to think about two different forms that relativism might take. Let's call them quotidian on the one hand and robust on the other. Quotidian relativism is a simple idea. It's just that thought that there's a great deal of difference of opinion across time and across space as to what is right and what is wrong. 500, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 years ago, people had different views from the views that we hold now, many of us, about right and wrong. So that's across time and across space. Even right now, go across the world and you'll find many different views about correct and incorrect, moral and immoral behavior. The idea of quotidian relativism is the stuff of cultural anthropology. You take a course in cultural anthropology, and within 5 minutes you'll be hearing our anthropological discussions of different tribes, different societies, different cultures across the world that have very different views about how to raise children, marriage, death, how to deal with suffering, how to conduct warfare, how to respect one another, etc. Very different views about right and wrong that might be shocking to us. Now, notice that just being told that as a matter of fact there are people out there with different views from you about right and wrong does not itself show anything very much about objective matters of fact, as it were. But just notice that there are some surprising examples that you're likely to come across if you read about different moral views across the world. There are different views about, for example, female circumcision, especially without anesthesia, slavery, treatment of people who are sick or elderly, racism, sexism, discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. There are things that in modern and many Western societies we've got fairly firm views about where those views are not shared by people in other parts of the world. So now we have to ask, how am I to settle disputes if people are disputing about these things? But notice that quotidian relativism just says there are different views out there. It doesn't say anything yet about whether any of those views is more right or more incorrect. Just as if a social scientist who studies views about disease tells us that some people think that people get sick because of germs, other people think that people get sick because of bad karma or cooties or somebody put a spell on them. So far, all she is telling us is different people's views. She's not saying anything at all about who's right and who's wrong. Maybe everybody's wrong. Maybe they're all in some sense right. But just describing people's different views is not itself to take a stand on whether or not any of those views is correct or incorrect. So too, quotidian relativism just says people have different views. It remains completely silent on whether any of those views is correct, incorrect, etc. And my point about quotidian relativism also is that it's hard to deny. It seems banal. It seems uncontroversial that there's a great deal of difference of opinion out there as to right and wrong. It's just making an empirical claim borne out by painstaking anthropological research about people's different attitudes across space and time. But it doesn't pass judgment in any sense on any of those views as being correct or incorrect, at least if it's carried out and discussed carefully. And therefore, quotidian relativism is perfectly compatible with the idea that there is a right answer to questions about morality. Just as somebody who points out different views about the causes of disease could consistently go on to say, some people think that diseases are caused by cooties, other people think that they're caused by witchcraft, other people think that they're caused by germs, and then that person could go on to say, but we now know that diseases are caused by germs, for example. That's perfectly consistent. So too, quotidian relativism is compatible with there being a, so to speak, fact of the matter about right and wrong. Whereas by contrast, the more challenging notion of robust relativism deserves consideration as well. This is the doctrine that there really is no fact of the matter as to what is right or wrong, and that moral facts are in some sense relative to a point of view. You can begin to think about what this means by considering the case of what time it is. Suppose you get a phone call from a friend, you have no idea where that friend is. Maybe they're calling you from somewhere from another continent, maybe they're calling you from across town. You have no idea where they are. And they say, what time is it? And you might wonder, well, wait, are you here in my time zone or are you somewhere in Siberia? That makes a difference for my answer to the question, what time is it? What time it is? What time it is, the point being, is just relative to what time zone you're in. And there are going to be some contexts in which asking what time it is doesn't make any sense at all. It makes no sense at all to ask the question, what time is it on the sun right now? What time is it on the other side of the Crab Nebula? These are questions that are nonsensical. Whereas once we do relativize to a time zone on the surface of this planet, talking about what time it is perfectly coherent, perfectly consistent, and you can be mistaken also that relative to a certain time zone, it's the time that you think it is. You might think it's 4 o'clock, it's not, it's 3 in Eastern Standard Time. This is all meant to be completely boring and banal, but it's a way of illustrating what the robust relativist seems to be saying, that somehow that right and wrong are in a sense relative to a point of view. Just as, take another example, whether something's big or small is relative to a kind of reference class. It makes sense to say, for example, boy, that is a big flea. Fleas generally, from the point of view relative to our own bodies, are small. But when somebody says that's a big flea, they generally mean, as fleas go, that's fairly large. Or that is a small elephant. Relative to what's standard for elephants, that's kind of a puny one. These things make perfect sense. So we relativize to points of view in some of our discourse. The question is whether we're doing that when we're discussing ethics. Moral objectivism, by contrast with moral relativism, holds that there is a fact of the matter as to what's right and wrong, and that this fact is not relative to a point of view. Moral objectivism does not tell us necessarily that we always know how to find out what the objective facts are, but it says there is a fact there to be known. And notice also that moral objectivism is compatible with quotidian relativism. That is to say, one could say there is a fact of the matter about right and wrong, even if there's lots of difference of opinion out there as to right and wrong. Notice also that if you're a moral objectivist, you need not be harassed by such slogans as "you're sitting in judgment," because after all, one can judge somebody else's behavior to be improper without necessarily thinking that you have to go change them and encroach upon their autonomy and so forth. I'll bet, thinking about your own life, I'll bet you've been in many situations in which you felt somebody else's behavior was immoral, was wrong. And I suspect you probably did not also think not just that it was wrong from their point of view or your point of view, but rather just plain wrong. So if you saw a situation in which, for example, a woman was being abused by her boyfriend, or a child was being treated improperly by a parent, you might not have said to yourself, well, from their point of view it's okay, but from my point of view it's not. I suspect you instead thought to yourself, that's just wrong, period. Now, you maybe chose to refrain from intervening, or maybe you intervened. But even if you chose to refrain from intervening, you might still have said, I'm going to hold my tongue, but I still think what they're doing is wrong. And when you say what you thought what they were doing was wrong, I suspect you're tapping into a more objectivist way of thinking about right and wrong. But that's something that admits of further development. Notice also that when we talk about robust relativism, it can come in different flavors, so to speak. Well, and that depends upon how we construe the kind of point of view in question. So some people will say that the point of view in question is a matter of a culture, others of a linguistic community, if we all speak the same language, that constitutes an ethical point of view. Others will say it's an ethnicity. If you're Native American or a particular tribe within the family of tribes in America, for example, that might create a particular point of view. Or if you're Italian, or if you're from a religious community, those could all be things that create an ethnicity in some sense. Others will say that the point of view in question is that of an individual. I'm not going to try to decide which is the best formulation or flavor of robust relativism. I just want you to be aware that it does take these different possible forms. Notice also that for the robust relativists, there will still be a real difference between right and wrong, but it's just relative to that point of view. Just as in the Eastern Standard Time Zone, if it's in fact 4 o'clock and I say it's 2:30, I'm mistaken. So too, relative to the point of view of, for example, Cherokee ethics, certain practices are going to be correct and proper, other practices will be incorrect and improper. But our question now is, what would, if anything, justify robust relativism? If one accepts quotidian relativism, as I suggest we all should, it seems pretty uncontroversial, well established empirically. if we accept quotidian relativism, and if we're careful to distinguish between quotidian and robust relativism, what would justify moving to that stronger, more challenging, and perhaps exotic notion of robust relativism? Well, let's go back to some of the slogans we discussed already. Somebody might say, it's all subjective anyway. Somebody might say, who's to say? Somebody might say, don't sit in judgment of others. Somebody might say, we need to respect the autonomy of other people's cultures, and so on. But let's go through each of these slogans and think about them. If somebody says, it's all subjective anyway, one might ask, well, how do you know that it's all subjective? Somebody would seem to have to know that there's no way of discerning objectively that some behaviors are more appropriate than others. Somebody who argues that it's all subjective, we might want to ask, well, is it really, here's an example of something that's truly subjective. Your preference with regard to ice cream flavors. George likes vanilla, Susan likes chocolate. If they have a debate about this, it seems like a silly thing, it seems like kind of a waste of time. I think we can be confident that there's not going to be any further investigation, either empirical or conceptual, the kinds of things philosophers might do, that would allow them to settle the question, which is a better flavor, chocolate or vanilla. But how do we know that it's going to be like that with regard to right and wrong? Perhaps as we get a deeper insight into ourselves, as we get a deeper insight into different forms of social existence, we will be able to justify claims such as one way of living and one way of behaving is better than another. So I suspect that the claim that it's all subjective anyway is a bit narrow-minded because it supposes that moral discussion is just like discussions that we carry out in an ice cream parlor when we choose different flavors. But that's something that needs to be established, not just assumed. Again, somebody might say, who's to say? Well, I would reply to that by saying, well, aren't we all entitled to have our say? Just as in many areas of life where we feel entitled to speak our minds about what we think is the best approach, so too, many of us are willing to speak out and justify our positions when it comes to proper or improper behavior. So one answer to the question, who's to say, is I am and so are you. Let's all say what we think and have a debate and share ideas, and hopefully we'll be able to learn from one another. When I say I'm to say, I'm not claiming that I've got more authority than somebody else, but rather that I've got as much authority as anybody else, and we should all jump in and discuss, see whether we can make some progress. Again, somebody might say, don't sit in judgment of others. To which I want to suggest, I actually think that, and like you to consider the thought that we sit in judgment of others very often. That is to say, if you're in a supermarket and you're shopping and you see a mother with her child and the child is misbehaving and the mother decides to swat the child very hard across the face in order to get the child to behave better, you might very well say to yourself, not necessarily out loud, but to yourself, that woman should not be doing that to that child. Or you might see a police officer behaving in a very rude way to an African-American motorist that the police officer has stopped for a minor traffic infraction. You might say that police officer is behaving in a way that's not just against police procedure, but perhaps is immoral. So you're sitting in judgment of the police officer. That does not make you a bad person. The point is rather, we sit in judgment of one another all the time without thereby necessarily thinking that we're godlike or have any special magical powers or privilege over others. Part of what we do is to judge one another and hope that sometimes those judgments are appropriate and justified. Again, when somebody says, respect the autonomy of other peoples and cultures and so forth, one might say, respect is a different thing entirely. I can judge that you're doing something mistaken or erroneous or even immoral and still respect you. For example, I might think that a parent is mistreating their child and still not want to intervene, at least up to a certain point, depending upon the nature of the mistreatment. I might think that corporal punishment, for example, is immoral as a way for a parent to treat a child, but I might bite my tongue. I might hold my tongue and say, I'm going to let this person do what they think is best. I think what they're doing is wrong, but I'm going to keep it to myself because trying to intervene, trying to change them, trying to violate their autonomy might cause even more problems beyond my trying to correct their behavior. So I can respect autonomy and still judge others, still think that there's a mistaken as opposed to a correct way of behaving. That is, be an objective thinker about morality without necessarily having to be hegemonic, without necessarily thinking that I've got a special right to go around bossing people around as to what they should be doing with themselves. So the thought here is, even if moral relativism as it's formulated in the robust relativist terms, is going to be something that you find attractive. What I want you to consider is what would justify that relatively exotic point of view. If we accept quotidian relativism, what would justify moving to the more exotic and demanding idea of moral relativism, particularly given that many of you, I think, probably think that there are some forms of behavior that are right, others that are wrong, period. Not relative to a point of view, but regardless of the point of view that you hold. And if that's right, then I'm doubtful that even though many people talk as if they're robust relativists, I'm doubtful of how many genuinely are. Many of us, I think, tend to confuse quotidian with robust relativism. If we avoid that confusion, it's not yet clear how much support there is for robust relativism that's still standing. So let me close today's discussion with an example from a bit over a century ago from the philosopher, explorer, anthropologist Edvard Westermarck, from his book, The Origin and Development of Moral Ideas, a sort of famous founding tract for one or another form of relativism. And he's discussing an example from Fijian islanders, and this example is one that should give us pause. The thought here is people do things that seem immoral on the surface, but if you look carefully at the belief systems that motivate the behavior, they end up with doing something. The morality or immorality of the behavior is much more complicated than meets the eye. So if you were to come across the Fiji Islanders, at least as the way they lived their lives a century or more ago, you might have been astonished and horrified at the fact that the way they treated their elderly. Younger men would take their fathers and at a certain age, before they became very old, maybe at the ripe age of 55 or something, would bury them alive after kissing them and saying goodbye to them. And they were not in particularly failing health or anything. And you might have thought, this looks like murder. Why are these people murdering their not terribly elderly parents? That seems immoral. But once we understand their belief systems, some of it begins to make sense. So, Westermarck writes, in Fiji, it was regarded as a sign of filial affection to put an aged parent to death. In his description of the Fijians, Dr. Seaman observes, Westermarck is quoting Seaman, in a country where food is abundant, clothing scarcely required, and property is as a general rule in the possession of the whole family rather than that of its head, children need not want for dead men's shoes in order to become well off, that is, they didn't have to take things from the elderly. And we may therefore quite believe them when declaring that it's with aching heart and at the repeated entreaties of their parents that they are induced to commit what we justly consider a crime. The ceremony is not without a touch of tragic grandeur. The son will kiss and weep over his father as he prepares him for the grave, and will exchange loving farewells with him as he heaps the earth lightly over him. One reason why the old Fijians so eagerly desired to escape extreme infirmity was perhaps the contempt which attaches to physical weakness among a nation of warriors, and the wrongs and insults which await those who are no longer able to protect themselves. But another, and as it seems more potent motive, was the belief that persons enter upon the delights of the future life, that is the afterlife, with the same faculties, mental and physical, as they possess at the hour of death, and that the spiritual life thus commences where the corporal existence terminates. That is, according to the Fijian belief system, you go into the afterlife with your body as it is when you die. Which means that if you die at an age in which you're very infirm, which you're very frail and so forth, your afterlife is going to be pretty bad. Whereas if you die at an age in which your body is still in pretty good shape and you have sound mind and so forth, your afterlife, which perhaps for them was going to be an eternity, would be not so bad, would be tolerable. Back to the quotation, with these views, says Dr. Hale, it is natural that they should desire to pass through this change before their mental and bodily powers are so enfeebled by age as to deprive them of their capacity for enjoyment. The idea being here as follows. If you were just to take a first glance at the Fijians and their way of treating their relatively aged parents, then you would think that they're just murdering them after they get above 55, for example, even while they're still physically in pretty good shape. But if you understand their belief systems, you might begin to see their behavior in a different light, and that particular thing that looks like murder is a way of preserving their well-being for the afterlife. From that perspective, then, what I want to suggest to you is, while we've seen reason for thinking that there being an objective fact as to what's right and wrong might still hold up, might still be a viable point of view, that's still consistent with the fact that we need to look carefully at the belief systems and ways of practicing going about life that are consistent with and that are at the basis of behaviors of many other social structures besides our own. Once we have those in view, we can understand a lot of behavior that on the face of it might seem bizarre and in many cases might even seem horrendous, but that at second glance, with deeper insight into how these people think about the world, will begin to make sense. That does not tell us how we should respond to an act of burying somebody alive when they're in perfectly good health, but I think should make us think twice about an initial knee-jerk or gut kind of reaction to behavior that on the face of it seems problematic.